Hey guys, welcome back to Salt and Light. This is our study in Ecclesiastes. This is part 7. We're going to be looking at chapter 7, and I've decided to call this lesson An Upright Man Found. Now, the reason I called it this is because this chapter begins the solution to our sin and death dilemma. Now, up until this point, chapters 1 through 6, Solomon is seeking for soul satisfaction. And in this chapter, this is the beginning of him exploring the solution, basically. So we're going to begin in verse 1. And verse 1 says this: "A good name is better than precious ointment." So what exactly is he saying here? Is he saying that a good reputation is better than some kind of cream that you rub on your body for healing? No, not necessarily. He's actually referring to the name of Christ here. And I have good reason to say this. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, it says this: "And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men." And then Christ himself said, "I do not receive honor from men, but I know you, that you do not have the love of God in you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe who receive honor from one another, but do not seek the honor that comes from the only God?" So I think this is talking about being seen as good in the sight of God, and that requires the name of Christ to be seen that way. So that is the good name he's referring to. And then when it says is better than precious ointment, ointment in the Bible is often another way to say wealth. It's lumped in with that category. It's something that you're trusting in, that's opposed to the name of Christ. So you can either trust in Christ or trust in fill in the blank. Anything in this world that brings you comfort, not false healing. It brings your body healing, but not true spiritual healing like Christ can. And how do we know that he's talking about Christ here? Well, in Proverbs 22, written by the same man, Solomon wrote Proverbs, it says, "A good name is more desirable than great riches." See, it's same type of thing. A good name is more desirable, which means better, than great riches, which ointment can be lumped into that. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. To be esteemed by who? Well, God, of course. Man's esteem merits nothing. Rich and poor have this in common: the Lord is maker of them all. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. And who's giving us these riches, honor, and life? Well, the man who is esteemed by the Lord gets these things from the Lord. So the Lord is the one who's giving these things. And how are we esteemed by him? If we have a good name. And is our name good? In and of itself, no, it's not. See, Christ is the one who gives us the good name. Now in Proverbs chapter 18, he says something similar as well. This is verse 10. He says, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are safe. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his own esteem." So the riches of this world appear to be a strong defense. Against what? Well, the Bible tells us we live in fear because we have no assurance of life. So when we trust in other things to give us life, they won't. But the Lord can and will to the ones who seek and trust in him. All right, so he continues. He says, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. So he's saying the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. All right, and the reason for this is our whole life, if you love God and have faith, is a work of God making you and molding you to be more like his son. Okay, and then the day of one's birth is actually worse because you're born into sin. You don't start out saved. However, as your life progresses, that's when you experience salvation. And then to make this point even more clear, he says this, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Now, Christ said something very similar to this, and remember, Solomon is one of the wisest men who ever lived next to Christ. Christ is wisdom embodied. So let's see what Christ had to say. However, before we look into what Christ said about these two houses, let me just say that a good example of the house of mourning, that when we dwell in that house, we are constantly thinking, not constantly, we are just thinking of our death and letting that motivate what we do and motivate what our focus should be on. And it should be on eternity, is kind of what he's getting at here. But the house of feasting, this is where the fool resides, the man who doesn't have faith, doesn't live by the statutes of God. He wants to just do his own thing, and he lives by his flesh. And what does the flesh desire? Basically pleasure. And that is the house of feasting. You want your reward in this world, and you don't really care to seek the reward in the next world. So like I said, Christ said something similar about two houses, and we're about to look at that, but before we do, Solomon continues that thought about the two houses, so let me just read that real quick. He says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. So if you're in the house of mourning, you see our issue, you see that through sin and death, which is what we deserve, we're basically doomed. So when you're sorrowful about that, you'll seek the remedy, is basically what he's saying, and God can make your heart glad. And then he continues in verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. Okay, so a man who knows he's in deep trouble, that he's basically looking at his situation saying, okay, there's death on the horizon. What can I do about this? Will be seeking a solution from someone who is wise. And who is that wise man? Christ and God. They're the same. So it's better to hear the rebuke of Christ than for a man to hear the song of fools. Well, what would be the song of fools? Well, Proverbs tells us that fools affirm you in the wrong way of going about life. So that would be the song of fools. It would be drinking in scorn. Okay, so let's look at what Christ said about the two houses, because Solomon and Christ are saying the same thing. So Matthew chapter 7 says this, and remember, this is where when Solomon said what he said about the two houses, he was a wise man, but he wasn't God. Now when we look at Christ, remember, he's God incarnate. He is wisdom itself. So let's see what he says, Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Then, right after that, he repeats this almost verbatim what he just said, changing a couple of words. And it's meant to show the contrast, the opposite. This is the wise man versus the foolish man. Verse 26 says, "But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." So what are the words that Christ is telling us to listen to? Well, you can read the Gospels and get so many things that he told us to walk in, but the main thing is to put your faith in his righteousness, because we don't have it on our own. But when we don't look to Christ, we by default are looking to our own righteousness and our own ways to save us, even if we don't realize that's what we're doing. Okay, so Solomon continues. Verse 5, he said, "Better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool." Now, this verse kind of confused me. I wasn't really sure what the crackling of thorns under a pot was referring to, but there's a couple of passages, in Psalms, written by David that has this exact language, and it'll give us a better understanding of what this is talking about. So in Psalm 58, it says this, "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. Their poison is like the poison of a serpent. They are like the deaf cobra that stops its ear, which will not heed the voice of charmers, charming ever so skillfully." So this first description of the wicked is they are like snakes. They are, they have poison under their tongues, and they stop up their ear. Remember what Christ said, "Those who hear my sayings and do not do them," they're basically stopping up their ear. They hear what Christ is saying, but they're not applying it, which means they're not heeding the voice of the charmer. And who is the voice of the charmer? Well, this would be the word of God, basically. This can come through Christ, the prophets, the church. These are the charmers. And it says they charm ever so skillfully. And when you charm a snake, you're basically making it less vicious, I guess you could say. And he continues, the psalm continues, "Let them be like a snail which melts away as it goes. Before your pots can feel the burning thorns." All right, so he's saying these thorns are on fire. And he continues, "He shall take them away as with a whirlwind, as in his living and burning wrath." So Solomon said that the crackling of thorns was like the laughter of the fool. Okay, and the fool is like these burning thorns. So ultimately, what is sin? Well, it's pursuing your sinful passions, and in that way of life is pursuing, it's almost like you're on fire. You're consuming yourself and others by sinning. And that's what sin is. Sin is what harms others' souls, others' livelihoods, your soul. Sin is the destructive agent that we have chosen to live in. And in that way, we are being consumed. And see, what God does is he withdraws himself from sin, which means you lack life, you lack love, and in place of that, you get the opposite: death, hatred, and things of that nature, which those things consume as opposed to give life. So when we live in sin, that's what you're doing to yourself and others. Now, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 27 I wanted to read this. Well, I don't see it. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 27 through 29 says this, "Can a man take fire to his bosom, and his clothes not be burned? Can one walk on hot coals, and his feet not be seared? So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her shall not be innocent." Well, I know what you're thinking. Landon, wait a second. This is talking about going into a harlot. And you're right, it is. You go and read Proverbs, that's exactly what it's talking about. However, I'm going to tie this in at the end. Yes, it's good advice not to sleep with another man's wife, obviously. But I feel like this is going a little bit deeper into something spiritual. And like I said, I'll tie it in at the end, so we're going to leave it there for a moment. But just realize that going into the harlot has the same type of description of what sin does to the sinner. All right, so we're going to go back to, let's see, Ecclesiastes. Let me find my place here. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're going to start back in verse 7. And verse 7 says this, "Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart." So we know what a bribe is. When I picture a bribe, I picture a judge in a courtroom about to hand down a judgment. And if somebody offers him money to judge in their favor, that is corrupting the judgment. Now, this, I believe, can be seen in another way. Think about the garden and Eve being tricked by the serpent. See, Eve, whenever sin had not entered the world yet, you could technically say they were innocent. So their heart was upright until the point in which they sinned. So what was the bribe Satan offered to Eve to get her to skew her judgment? Well, the bribe was this. Did God say that you not to... I might have to go and read it. But basically he said, this tree can make you wise. See, this tree can improve you in some way if you take of it. Disobey God, and it will give you wisdom. Now, Solomon's going to say something similar to this, and I want to point that out when we get there, but just keep in mind, this whole lesson is going to wrap around what Eve had done in the garden. But just keep that in mind. All right, so now Job had this problem as well. See, he was a man of faith, and men of faith are wise. If you're trusting the Lord, you're wise. That's just the bottom line. However, he kept company with his 3 friends that said they believed in God, but they actually didn't. They believed in a God that they had made up in their heads. They didn't believe in the true God. So these men were foolish, and they were men of scorn. So when Elihu confronts Job, this is what he says. Verse 7. Well, let's see. What chapter was that? Job chapter 34, verse 7. It says, "What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water, and goes in company with the workers of iniquity, and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God." So that was something Job had said because of the influence of his friends. Now that was a foolish statement. Job took his eyes off of God and started to side with the wicked. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20 says this, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." And that goes to show you, the fool is like the burning fire. They're following their sinful passions, and if you take counsel with them, you yourself will suffer harm. And that's what was happening with Job. He was letting their influence take his eyes off the one who gives him wisdom. All right, so Solomon continues verse 8. He says, "The end of a thing is better than its beginning." Now, what is he talking about here? He's talking about the work of God in the end will bring you to look more like Christ. So, and then he'll go on to say something more profound. He says, "The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools." All right, before we go on to the anger part, let me just focus on the end of a thing is better than its beginning. What is the will of God in the life of the believer? Let me read you this out of Romans chapter 8, verse 20, starting in verse 27. "Now he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God." Well, what is the will of God? It goes on to tell you. "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God." So these things that work together for good take time. And it doesn't happen right at the beginning. It happens at the end. All right, so he goes on. He says, "To those who are called according to his purpose." Now, his will, his purpose, these are one and the same. "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." So what is his purpose and will? Remember, whenever you put your faith in Christ, you are now one with him. Now the rest of your life, God is going to work to conform you to his image. And in the end, he will completely make you new. Now, we are already made new, yet there is a process going on throughout our life for God to make us more like Christ. All right, so the ending is better than the start. So anyways, so let's continue in Ecclesiastes. He says, "Patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools." Now, I have to constantly say this reminder because we tend to forget. A fool is someone who does not have faith. Therefore, they are not wanting the will of God to be done in their life. They're wanting their will to be done. Now, that's where anger actually comes from. If you want God's will to be done in your life, you will be okay with adversity, because we know adversity creates in us character and makes us look more like Christ. All right, so that's what it means to be patient in spirit. You're patient in your adversity, but the proud in spirit is something that's not good. And then it goes on to say, "For anger rests in the bosom of fools." Now, a good example of this is Jonah. God had his will, and he told Jonah to go and preach to the Ninevites. That was God's will. God's will was to show mercy on the Ninevites, to give them the message to repent. However, Jonah hated the Ninevites. So what was Jonah's will? Jonah wanted them to perish. Okay? Now, let me give you some verses to kind of show you where I'm going with this. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23 says this about God's will. "Have I any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord God, and not rather that he should turn from his way and live." See, there's God's desire laid out for us in Ezekiel. Now, let's read in Jonah chapter 3. This was after Jonah had went his own way. God, brought the fish to take him under, and then he was spat back up. Then Jonah listened. He went and did God's will. He preached to the Ninevites, and the Ninevites repented. Okay? So all of heaven was rejoicing, but what did Jonah do? It says in verse 10, "Then God saw their works," talking about the Ninevites, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them. And he did not do it. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. Now, why did he become angry? Because he was wanting his will to be accomplished and not God's. Okay, that's our example right there. All right, so continuing in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 10. He says, "Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this." Now, this was something Job had done in Job chapter 29, verse 2. Job had said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when my steps were bathed with cream, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me." So Solomon said that that is not a wise thing to do. Then he goes on to say, "Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun." Okay, so this part is pretty confusing, I would say, and I'm not quite sure if I'm interpreting this right. So if you want to leave a comment at the bottom, let me know what you think about it. That would be great. But I'm going to give you what I think this is talking about. So verse 11, it says, "Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun." So this makes me think that he's talking about worldly wisdom here. And remember, I can't remember which video it was, but worldly wisdom is basically you being wise with your money. Okay? Now, if you're wise with your money, but you lack faith, then nothing is good. Nothing you do is good, because God is not involved in it. But once you have faith and God becomes involved, then you will respond to your wealth correctly. So it says wisdom is good with an inheritance. Now, who gives the inheritance? God does. God gives you the power to eat of your wealth. So then he goes, "and profitable to those who see the sun." That phrase, "see the sun," makes me think the wisdom that is under the sun, which that's why I think it's talking about worldly wisdom here. So worldly wisdom is good. It says wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. All right, so once you have the wisdom of God, you know how to handle wealth correctly and not to trust in it, but use it to further God's kingdom. And you're storing up treasures in heaven at that point, which that is the inheritance. Okay, you see? All right, so in verse 12, now this is also why I think it might be talking about worldly wisdom, because of the next verse. He says, "For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense." All right, so you can see that he's relating this to money. In this world, money can be a defense in this way. You put back money, and if a storm rolls through, destroys your house, you're like, "That's okay. I put back some money. I can, fix the damages or buy a new house." So in that way, it's a defense. All right. Then he goes on to say, "But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it." So right here, I believe he's talking about the wisdom that God gives. See, that's the difference between the worldly wisdom and the godly wisdom. When God gives you wisdom, it gives you life. But worldly wisdom by itself cannot do it. Okay, so then he goes on, verse 13. Oh, let me stop here and read something out of Isaiah that I think would go well with this. All right, so Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 7. It says, "Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Yes, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Then he goes on to say, listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and let your soul delight itself in abundance. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear, and your soul shall live. And I will make an everlasting covenant with you, the sure mercies of David. Indeed, I have given him as a witness to the people, a leader and a commander for the people. Surely you shall call a nation you do not know, and nations who do not know you shall run to you, because of the Lord your God and the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. Seek the Lord while he may be found, call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God he will abundantly pardon. So that is the gift, mercy and abundance, and abundantly pardoning us. All right, but at the beginning here, it basically said to come buy and eat. Buy the Lord's wine and the Lord's bread for free. It says without money and without price. So this is a gift from God, but he's saying you have to come to him, though. See, that's the kicker, okay? All right. So continuing in verse 13, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, it says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. Okay, so when it says consider the work of God, this means man has nothing to do with this work. So think about it. When he says, who can make straight what he has made crooked? Does anybody want to experience adversity? If you could decide how your days were, if you could map out your life and everything would come to pass which you wanted, would you choose any days where you would experience adversity? Well, no, of course not. Nobody wants to go through hard times. Okay, so that is actually the proof that we don't truly have control over our lives and that it's a work of God. Do you see what he's getting at here? He's saying, yes, when you're prospering, when everything's going your way, be joyful in the Lord and be thankful. However, in the day of adversity, don't curse God, because God has surely appointed that day as well as the day of prosperity for a good reason for those who love him. So if you have faith in God even in those hard, tumultuous times. So don't be like Job. This is something Job had an issue with, and when Elihu was confronting him, this is what he said, Job chapter 37, beginning in verse 14. Elihu said to Job, listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know when God dispatches them, talking about the clouds, and causes the light of his cloud to shine? Do you know how the clouds are balanced? Those wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? Why are your garments hot when he quiets the earth by the south wind? With him have you spread out the skies, strong as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. So that is going along exactly with what Solomon says here. He says, man can find out nothing that will come after him. And that's what Elihu's saying as well. He says, we can't prepare anything to teach God because we don't know what the next day holds, let alone should we correct a holy and just God. Okay. So he continues in verse 15, Ecclesiastes chapter 7. He says, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. See, and that right there is proving Solomon's point even further. See, when we look at a just man, we would say, well, he should be prospering, yet he's perishing. And then when we look at the wicked man who is in prosperity, we look at that snippet of his life and say, wow, shouldn't he be perishing? Shouldn't he have some kind of punishment upon him? See, and that's just man's guesses at what the future of these men should look like. And Job's friends actually prove this. See, in Job chapter 32, when it introduced Elihu into the book, it says, then the wrath of Elihu was aroused against Job because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends his wrath was aroused, because they had found no answer, yet condemned Job. So why did Job's friends condemn him? Because of his circumstances. They looked at all the perishing, they're like, well, A plus B equals C. Since you're perishing, you must be wicked. You know, that was their conclusion, but that wasn't correct at all. However, now we're going to look at Job's side of the equation. Job was looking at himself as more righteous than he ought. Now, Job chapter 19 verse 6 says this. This is what Job was saying about God. He said, know then that God has wronged me, and he has surrounded me with his net. So he's accusing God of wronging him. Why would he do that? Well, Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 25 says this about the Israelites. See, now this is dealing with a nation, and God deals with the nations the same way as he would an individual. He says to the nation of Israel in Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 25, yet you say, the way of the Lord is not fair. Hear now, O house of Israel, is it not my way which is fair, and your ways which are not fair? And then in Ezekiel chapter 33 verse 17, he gives the same idea here. He says, yet your people say the way of the Lord is not just, when it is their own way that is not just. See, and that's what Job didn't understand. Job didn't see himself as a sinner. He was seeing himself as more righteous than he was, and that was his problem. So then Ecclesiastes chapter 7 goes on to give us these 2 sides and the dangers of both sides. In verse 16 it says, do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? So overly righteous means you're not walking in truth. Now you regard the law of God, but you think in the law of God that you can be yourself righteous. And that's where the error is made. You're not walking in the truth that everyone's a sinner, that I'm a sinner, that I don't deserve God's grace. That's the truth. Yet the one who believes he's carrying out the law of God perfectly misses it. You see? And then the other side, the overly wicked, see, they just totally go head first into sin. They just dive straight into it and just love it. See, that's the other side of the boat that is not going to save your soul at all. Wickedness won't deliver the soul. Righteousness will. So the overly righteous have the right idea, but however, that's not the means by which God saves. So both of these can be equally as dangerous because neither one will save you. Now he says, verse 18, it is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other. For he who fears God will escape them all. See, the overly righteous and the overly wicked have an issue. This is the issue. They don't have a true fear of God. When you have a true fear of God, this is what happens. You approach God's entire counsel very carefully and with reverence, and you consider every little jot and tittle. Now it says, the one who fears the Lord will escape them all. That means you're going to run to the shelter that God gives you. Okay, and what is his shelter? His shelter is Christ, and through Christ, you get God's grace and mercy. See, when you accept his entire counsel, when you get to the end of it, you accept the remedy God has provided. All right, and you realize you can't match his righteousness when you carefully consider everything. All right, so that's what the fear of the Lord means. So he continues, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 19. He says, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. So there's a contrast here. 10 rulers of a city would seem very, very strong. Okay, this is a comparison of man's attempt at his own security versus God's security. Now, if you have faith in God, he gives ultimate security, the highest power in all the earth and all the universe has redeemed you, and no one can undo that. Romans chapter 8, verse 31 says, if God is for you, who can be against you? Man can do nothing to you if God is for you. Okay, now in verse 20, continuing, he says, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. All right, so what does this mean? It's worded a little confusing. It says, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Now this can sound like, okay, this is just saying that all men are sinners and no one's just, but that's not what it's saying here. It's saying, for there is not a just man on earth who does not sin, who does good and does not sin. What he's saying here is there are just men on earth through faith that sin. That's basically what it's saying. It's saying upright and justified men still fall short. That's what it's saying. And he goes on to say, now this is proving his point. Verse 21, also do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. So he's almost guaranteeing that you will hear people backstab you, talk about you behind your back, and slander you. And then he goes on to say this, and the reason he said don't take it to heart is because of this reason right here. He says, for many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. And basically, this is what he's saying. He's saying all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, so don't take it personal when you're sinned against, because you're also a sinner. That's what he's getting at. Now he continues in verse 23. He says, all this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Now, what is he saying here? Let me read you some things out of Job that'll give us more clarity about what he's saying. This is Elihu speaking to Job when he's seeking to give him a good answer for why he's suffering. Okay? Elihu says, bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar. Same language. I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. And he's talking about God. Behold, God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty in strength of understanding. All right, so when Solomon says, I have proved all this by wisdom, by the word all, I'm not quite sure what he's meaning. He might mean everything up until this point. All of this I've proved by wisdom. Or he could be referring to just, the first little bit of this chapter. However, he said that he said to himself, I will be wise, but it was far from me. All right, now think of Eve in the garden. What did the serpent say to her? Well, I'm going to read it to you. Genesis chapter 3, verse 4. This is when the serpent was tempting Eve. Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. So when Eve took of the fruit of the tree, did she become more wise? No, far from it. Eve became less wise. She became a fool. All right, and up until this point, Solomon has been doing the same thing. He's been pursuing the things of the world to find wisdom and knowledge. Yet God is not, he can't be found in the things of this world. Okay? However, that doesn't mean he can't be found. All right? So he continues, verse 24, he says, "As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out?" And Elihu said something very similar in Job chapter 36, verse 26. "Behold, God is great, and we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered." See, there's a sense in which we cannot know God fully. Now, when we have faith in him, God gives us the knowledge that he knows we can handle and that we need to be reunited with him. All right? Now, Solomon continues. He says, "I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness." Now, how do we find the wisdom of God? How can we gain access to it? I think this is a good time to include the words of Jesus here. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Jesus, wisdom embodied, said, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you." And then in James chapter 1, verse 5 through 8, James says this about finding wisdom. He said, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." Okay, so Jesus and James, they both said, ask of the Lord for wisdom. Seek him in faith, and he will give you wisdom. All right. So now we're going to continue in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 26. All right, now this is where it gets good and confusing, but I'll explain. He says, "And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets." All right, so this woman who ensnares man, he finds that more bitter than death. But why? See, rather than being entrapped by whoever this woman is, he would rather die. Okay. So what is he talking about here? Well, if you go to his other writings in Proverbs and, Proverbs, some of the Psalms he wrote, you'll find this woman described in the same way as he's describing here. All right, and this is worse than death itself. And what's worse than death itself? Well, the second death. And how do we get there? If you die in your sin, and what does sin do to you? It entraps you and snares you. All right? So this woman, I feel, and I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure it's referring to this world and the traps that Satan has set in this world for us to take our eyes off of the one who can save us. Okay? All right, so he continues to describe this woman whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God will escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. So who pleases God? The man who has faith. Faith is the only way you please God. All right, and that man will escape from this woman. All right, but the sinner, the one who does not have faith, the fool, he will be trapped by her. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. So up until this point, remember, Solomon is seeking for something. His soul is craving something, and he's trying all these things. Nothing has satisfied him. And then he says this, "Here is what I have found," says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason. So he's saying, I'm putting two and two together. He continues, "which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find." So he's saying that was his issue up until now. Then he says, "one man among 1,000 I have found." Now, in Job chapter 33, Elihu actually gives Job the gospel. Now, I'm not sure if you have seen my Job series, but I encourage you to go see that. But the gospel is included in the book of Job, and I'm going to read it to you. So when Elihu was speaking with Job, giving him the way to be right in God's eyes, this is what Elihu said. Remember the phrase, "one man among 1,000 I have found." That's what Solomon said. So in Job, Elihu says, "They draw near to the pit, and their life to the messengers of death. Yet if there is an angel at their side, a messenger, 1 out of 1,000, sent to tell him how to be upright, and he is gracious to that person and says to God, 'Spare them from going down to the pit. I have found a ransom for them. Let their flesh be renewed like a child's. Let them be restored as in the days of their youth.' Then that person can pray to God and find favor with him. They will see God's face and shout for joy. He will restore them to full well-being." So that was the gospel in the book of Job, which I really love how that's put. And he goes on to tell you what the attitude of the man of faith is, and I think that's profound and superb as well. So I encourage you to go read that chapter in Job. It's Job chapter 33. Anyway, so same wording when they're describing the messenger that comes to their side and acts as a mediator in their place. Okay, so Solomon's saying the same thing. He has found an upright man. Okay, now he goes on to, now this is where it gets confusing, and I have, like I said, I have a way that I like to see this, and I could be wrong, but I feel like I'm not. So, like I said, if you disagree, you can always leave a comment. So he goes on, he says, "But a woman among all these I have not found." Now, Solomon's not being racist here, but it is a little confusing. He says, "A man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found." Now, this is how I interpret this. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23 says this, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior." So it gives us this picture of Christ and the church being like a marriage, like the husband and the wife. You're bonded together with Christ if you have faith in him. Now that includes not just women, that includes all men. So all men and women who put their faith in Christ is like a bride to Christ. Okay, now 1 Peter chapter 3 says this, verse 7, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. Okay, so Peter says the woman is like the weaker vessel. Now, if you see Christ in the church, Christ as the only upright man, and the church, the woman, the bride, is the church upright? Yes, when we're joined to Christ, we are. But if they were left to themselves, they wouldn't be. So who's the weaker vessel is what I'm saying. The church is the weaker vessel. Okay, that's why Solomon, I believe, says, a woman among these I have not found. He's talking about all of man is not strong enough to save himself, okay? So in that way, man is the weak vessel. And I'm not saying Christ is a vessel, a strong vessel or anything. He is strength itself, okay? All right, so Solomon goes on. He says, truly this I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Okay, now what is this saying? He's saying man was made to be upright. However, we have sought out many schemes, which is basically talking about our sin. Okay, think of the garden. Think of Eve. She did not believe God when he said that she would die if she took of the fruit. All right, she sought out a scheme to be wise. All right, and that was her error, and that's all of man's error, and that's why Christ is the upright one who can bring righteousness back to man. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I really enjoyed studying this chapter, and I believe it can bring us a lot of wisdom. This whole book is not a depressing book. It's a book of hope, okay? So from here on out, Solomon is going to focus more on the solution, so please join us for the next chapters. We're going to be looking at chapter 8. I hope you all have a great week, and God bless you all.